Welcome. My name is Tori Yu. Thank you for joining the LBJ School's online event, where a panel of experts will unpack Tuesday's election. Our policy experts are Stephen Pedigo, an urban policy expert and director of the LBJ Urban Lab, Sherri Greenberg, a former state representative and the Dean for State and Local Engagement at the LBJ School, Dr. Sergio Garcia-Rios, Director of Polling at Univision News and Associate Director for Research at the LBJ School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and Dr. Jeremi Suri, a presidential historian and the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership and Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us. We'll do this in 10-minute blocks. There'll be time for audience questions at the end. Please go ahead and use the Q&A function in the Zoom. So Stephen, let's start with the city of Austin. We are undecided on mayor, but first, how does one find themselves in a runoff?
Well, first of all, Tori, thanks for organizing it. It's good to see you with everybody. Hope everybody got a little bit more sleep than I did and wasn't sort of staying up late and refreshing the results. The runoff on the mayor election in Austin, obviously, to win outright the mayoral election here in the city of Austin, you have to receive 50% of the vote. And because we had a number of candidates running in that election, there was a really challenging opportunity for anyone to get a majority of votes. So because of that, we're moving into a runoff situation where we're going to see Representative Israel and former state senator and former mayor Kirk Watson battling for the lead position as we look to the December runoff.
So what do the two final candidates say about the city and where it's headed?
It's interesting, right? I think a lot. So first and foremost, right? I'm actually pretty excited about the runoff because we're actually going to get to talk about policy now, right? I think that the election, the previous forums, while we talked about policy, there was a lot of voices and a lot of noise, perhaps, happening in the debates. And so now we're going to get an opportunity really to see how both of these candidates really differ in their opinions. We know that a lot of folks in Austin are caring about housing affordability. There's lots of conversations about our land use, how we're challenged with the unhoused, how we think about policing, et cetera. And so now I think for the next few weeks, we'll actually get to see how those two candidates differ on those issues. I think that what's striking about those results, I think if you go to the Travis County Election Center and you look and you sort of click up our results by the map, and there's a stark geographical divide, and you see, Senator Watson sort of leading in sort of North Austin and sort of West Austin, and you see Representative Israel sort of within sort of the eastern part of the city on the other side of Mopac around the university, et cetera. And so that speaks, I think, to a lot about perhaps the way we think about Austin in terms of mobility, in terms of new Austin versus old Austin. There's a lot of folks that have been sort of thinking about that in that sense of in terms of sort of more established Austin being in the west part of the city, and obviously East Austin, where we're seeing newer, younger residents. We're seeing revitalization of those communities, as well as, frankly, the pressures of gentrification and displacement in those areas. Right, those areas are being really at the forefront, and so. I think that this election speaks a lot to the identity of the city and how the city sort of sees itself, particularly geographically as well, around those issues. And so it will be interesting to follow to see if how both candidates are able to get out the vote. I think if you look back to the previous runoff election, less than 10% of voters actually participated in the the runoff election. And what actually makes this one even more challenging, particularly for a University of Texas student or a student, is that it's happening after we're done with finals, and it's happening after we're moving into winter break. So that engagement piece is going to be an interesting thing to follow, I think.
So speaking of campus, we also had several seats on city council up for grabs, and where those races are headed into runoffs as well. Can you tell me a little bit about District 9 and what that outcome looked like last night?
Yeah, first and foremost, it was one of when you looked at the district results, it was one of the districts that had some of the greatest turnout participation, which I think was outstanding, and it speaks a lot to the engagement that we saw on campus. And obviously, with the candidates now, you have you've got Zoe and you've got Linda that are both competing in that election. And frankly, there's an interesting generational divide there, perhaps, right? You've got a really young candidate in Zoe, you've got sort of an established candidate and Linda that's running, who's well known and established in the sort of downtown Austin circles, being engaged on the Parks Board, Downtown Commission, and other things. And it's when you look at the results, obviously, so really must registered and sort of resonated really well with the university student base, right? And so again, I think this is an interesting one to follow as we see how turnout's going to impact on this. Particularly, can both candidates engage their electorates as we're looking to the runoff election as well. I think, and so for me, it's also this interesting question in this district about university interests and downtown interests, and sort of how those are sort of grouped together, and thoughts around that. In my district, in District 3, it was a really tight race. I live in District 3, and Jose and Daniela running almost neck and neck, frankly. And frankly, one of the things I did actually before this was actually go back and look at their platforms and spend some time looking at their websites. And diving deeper into their work. And what's interesting is they're both running on a lot of the similar issues: housing for all, affordability, the idea of having real representation in the neighborhood. And so again, I think this turns all of these actually will turn out to the idea of representation. I think the most exciting thing for me when I look at these races, and I think when you think about the system which we're in, which is a 10-1 system, we could submit that the 10-1 system did exactly what we'd hope it would do, and that would be create greater diversification and greater representation of our neighborhoods and people across the city of Austin. And I think what's exciting about the council makeup and the potential council makeup is that it's going to look a lot like our city in terms of gender diversity, in terms of racial diversity, in terms of, frankly, we've got some political diversity too, right? In terms of some of our previous members of council, and I think one other point to point out about the council elections is that you have to give a hats off to Councilmember Paige Ellis and Harper Madison, obviously, for winning their elections outright. Right, their campaigns really have resonated with their voters, and were able to turn out their voters. With pretty impressive turnout. I think about 60% of the vote, actually, when you look at that.
What should voters expect as we head into the runoffs?
It's a good question. Hopefully not a negative campaign. I'm hopeful. I think. I hope we do see some forums around policy. For those of us that really care about housing policy, let's take Watson and Israel's plans and put them up against each other and see which plan really kind of makes sense for the city. Let's evaluate. I think particularly for mayor, the ability to build coalitions is going to be super important, and be able to engage both public and private sector leaders around some of our challenges. So we should be thinking about those issues. I think this is I think for policy geeks, it's a great opportunity to see those issues. I think for the campaigns, the biggest issue they face, right, is getting voters to come back out and vote again. That second time election, those runoff elections, you don't want to be the candidate that's left at the altar, so to speak, right? So you've got to really push hard to get your voters back out, and particularly for an election that is going to be sort of deeper into December than even, for instance, the Georgia Senate runoff, right? We'll still be waiting for mayor. We will know the results of the Georgia Senate race before then. So.
You mentioned housing a moment ago. Austin passed a $350 million affordable housing bond. What is significant about this?
It's the largest we've ever passed in terms of affordable housing. I think it speaks to I think the thing that I took away from all the bond elections, right, is that no matter the candidate you supported, if you supported Watson or Israel in the mayoral race, or candidates along your city council, is that the Austin voters continue to vest back into city building, right? They're very much committed to investing into their community. And so, you look at the proposition around affordable housing. It's going to largest bond to put towards affordable housing that cities ever done. So real commitment to supporting affordable housing, and that passed overwhelmingly, right? So there's a real commitment there. I think you look at the support for the school upgrades. Again, thinking about the investments back into our schools and back into this. And then also just the investments in workforce development, right, with the ACC work, right? So there's this real commitment, I think, to city building. And so, for me, as someone that kind of thinks about cities and the state of Texas, a lot of the issues about, addressing the issues that cities will face, particularly Texas cities in terms of affordability, the issues of, investing in schools and workforce development, it's all coming back to the feet of the voters. And we're doing it through propositions, partly because, frankly, we've had a pretty absentee state. And we'll talk. I know Sherri's going to talk about state, and I don't want to go that way, but you've got a real commitment at the municipal level to think about city building in Travis County, and I think you see this in other places too, in Harris and others. And so, we're as voters, we're doing city building by proposition, which is an interesting way to think about investment into a community, perhaps.
Thank you, Stephen. If folks have other questions about the city of Austin and its election, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll have time for them at the end. All right, Sherri, let's talk about the statewide and congressional races. Republicans dominated the statewide races. How did they reach voters and maintain their stronghold?
This was not a surprise. First of all, if we look at the lay of the land, Republicans have had a stronghold on the statewide races now for almost 30 years. So you have this culture that's built up, this expectation, this incumbency in the statewide races, and you cannot overlook that. You also have a situation where, as I say, there's been talk for 20 years about demographics in Texas. Demographics. Texas is purple, Texas is blue. Demographics do not vote. People either vote or they don't vote. And Texas is a low turnout state in general as far as voting. And the Democrats were not able to get the turnout that they were hoping for in this election. Meanwhile, the Republicans, if you look at the map, continued their strength in the rural areas, and they had a message of attaching, for instance, in the governor's race, Beto O'Rourke to Biden. They hit hard on the economy and on crime and immigration. If you look, in fact, though, at the border, Beto O'Rourke actually did really well. And if you look at the congressional races, the Democrats won 2 of the 3. One was redistricted, and I'll get to that in a minute, for a Republican, so that wasn't a surprise. Henry Cuellar has always run to the right of the National Democratic Party. He is a Democrat, so he maintained his seat. And then the other one was a victory. So what we've seen is, despite all the discussion on both sides from Democrats and Republicans, really the status quo being maintained in many ways. If you look at the state legislative districts, the Texas House and Senate, again, that redistricting word, right? Every 10 years, the lines are redrawn, and whichever party is in power is going to use its power to draw lines that will maximize the number of districts it hopes for its party, here the Republicans, and also those who are already in office. Most of them are incumbents and want to come back, so they'll maximize that. So we didn't see a lot of change in the races in the House and Senate. The Republicans will pick up a few, which was expected. But the issue of redistricting is very important when we look at what is happening in both the congressional races in Texas and at the state legislative level.
So how did redistricting impact this cycle?
So every 10 years we do redistricting. There are always court cases, and there are always lawsuits that have been filed, and that happened this time too. We also have issues with voter laws, and there have been lawsuits regarding that. And so we have legislation at the state level on both how the districts are assembled or reassembled, and on voting and voting access. And I think both of those are important to consider. With the redistricting, it did mean that there was a congressional seat in the Valley, I think, along the border, that did go to the Republicans. It was drawn for a Republican. And I think that it's meant that in the Texas House and Senate that you've seen very little change. No one was talking about Democrats gaining a bunch of seats, for instance, this time. That wasn't in the cards. What they've talked about, and I think we'll see, is a few seats being gained by Republicans. What you saw for the most part is the maps worked as the party in power here. The Republicans had drawn them with those first of all, with incumbents maintaining, because they're part of the process of drawing the maps here in Texas, maintaining their seats, and with the ability to, you know, as we say, crack and pack, form districts in ways that you will maybe pack some Democrats in one and form some other districts where you can gain a few more Republican seats, which I think we will see. So I think that the way that the districts were redrawn was successful for the intention of those who were drawing them.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned earlier, all eyes were on South Texas. Democrats and Republicans were trying to hold or flip 3 congressional seats. Why were these seats so critical? And can you break down the results?
So the seats were so critical because, of course, we know that nationwide, all eyes have been on Congress. You know, there was a sentiment, and we're still, it's the known unknown, and we have some unknowns today, right, as far as Congress. But certainly there were seats that we know the Republicans have picked up. Others are still in play. It's tending to look like that the House will go Republican, although not with the tsunami that was expected or that was discussed or that was hoped for. And the Senate, will see if the Democrats maintain control barely of the Senate. But getting back to why those seats are important in South Texas, it goes back to who is going to control the U.S. House of Representatives and who becomes Speaker. And what that means, we're at the policy school, policy and public affairs and public management, what that means for policy, what that means for governance. And so it was really critical. And as I said, Henry Cuellar kept his seat. He'd had tough races, but he's known how to keep his seat, right? There was one that was drawn for Republican, went to the Republican, and the other one went to the Democrat. So 2 out of the 3 stayed with Democrats, 1 went Republican.
So what do the midterms mean for the upcoming legislative session? What could be on the agenda?
So as far as the upcoming legislative session, we are not going to have a change of cast, right? We're going to have the same governor, the same lieutenant governor. In the Texas House, there will be a vote for speaker, but not expecting a change there. Actually, we will have the same controller, attorney general. So the same cast of characters. And what that means for the midterm agenda is that the things that those people have been talking about will be the agenda. The state of Texas has quite a large surplus right now as far as the budget. As we know, there's only one bill that must pass, and that's the budget. This time, there will not be gnashing of teeth. What are we going to cut? But how are we going to use that money? Governor Abbott has already said he wants to use its $27 billion surplus for property tax cuts. So you'll see that. Issues of the border and immigration, education, safety, voting, all of those will be on the table.
Thank you, Sherri. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Sergio Garcia-Rios for more on the Latino vote. Oh, forgive me. I think I missed my first question for you, so I'm going to jump to my second one. Why didn't Republicans make the gains they had hoped for in South Texas?
Yeah, coming into this election, I think there was a lot of conversation about Latinos shifting towards the Republican Party. I think there's been shifts. I think our research conducted through LBJ and Univision has shown that there are clear differences between Latino voters, Black voters, and white voters in Texas. It makes for a very, I agree that demographics don't vote, but demographics make different policy preferences. I agree with Sherri here. And in that sense, we see different takes on what matters for voters. What we found was that the economy mattered for everyone. All groups really were concerned about not so much about inflation in this abstract way that we tend to talk about, but about affordability and sort of what much it costs to live, that daily expense that people, the challenge of getting into the supermarket and getting gas at the pump, all those things really drove people to vote. But there were other issues that were important to voters. And so for Latinos in specific, the second most important issue, for the first time, we've been asking these questions for a few years now. And for the first time, we see that the second issue is mass shootings and gun control. And this is clearly a response to what happened in Uvalde and what happened in El Paso. And so this was very close to mind to Latino voters. And then the second issue for everyone in Texas was border security, but not for Latinos. And so I think the conversation, and sort of, again, it was alluded already how along the border, Beto is able to hold a majority, which is different from what we have been observing, is precisely because the conversation at the border in these highly Latino districts and counties is that there's a concern about security, there's a concern about crime and fentanyl and cartels, but not so much about immigration, and which is a different conversation that might be happening in the rest of the state. And so there's that disconnect where they might see the Republican Party as an answer in terms of economic issues, but not so much in other issues. And so what we're seeing here is a challenge for parties, but also a reality reflected, as Stephen mentioned, right? We're probably seeing the reflection of what the state is now. A state that's diverse in terms of demographics, and a state that's diverse in terms of policy preferences. And a good example of this is Texas 34, where Mayra Flores was projected to be the next rockstar at the national level. We hear, if you're outside Texas, you'll think that everyone is talking about her in Texas. Our poll found that actually she wasn't that popular. And in fact, in her own county, Hidalgo County, that's where she lost the most points. And so I think Latinos are not that sure which party will really cater to their needs. I think when you ask them, you find that 1 in 4 actually don't believe that either party cares about them. And so I think Latino voters are becoming more and more sophisticated in the sense that they'll vote for the things that they care about, and not so much with an obsession about one single party. And that's what both parties need to learn.
So what generalizations about that Latino vote have people gotten wrong?
Well, one is that immigration is the sole issue that that Latinos vote on, and we've been observing this issue being 4th, 5th in the list. Latinos worry right now about, especially Latinos in Texas, worry about the economy, about the cost of living, about education, and they think immigration is important, but not the most important, right? And probably the second one is abortion, which many people believe there's this general sense that because of the Catholic tradition among Latinos, that abortion will be very important and they will be anti-abortion. Poll after poll we have found, and the LBJ Univision poll certainly found that this is not an issue that they care so much about. It's important, but not the most important, even for Latinas. Again, bread and butter issues were more important. But then also at the same time, there's a lot of favorability towards a law that would actually allow some form of abortion. And so there's actually support towards allowing some forms of abortion. And so I think this is one of the biggest mischaracterizations of the Latino vote, that it's a vote that can, all these issues, the way that partisan issues were sorted, were built without Latinos in the conversation. So I think Latinos have this complex set of ideas and preferences and policy preferences that don't fully align with one party or another. And I think Texas is the perfect example of those policy preferences, complex policy preferences at display.
How will both parties continue outreach to the Latino community here in Texas?
So we've been talking a lot about these Latina candidates being running on their Republican tickets, and I think we have to see more of that. And we also see a Latina running in Austin, and so I think we need both parties to reach out to Latinos and Latinas and ask them to run. I think in a state where close to 30% of the population is eligible to vote are Latinos, the potential for the Latino vote is immense. And it's just a matter of actualizing and actually making it possible. And when Latinos feel like neither party really speaks to their issues, they feel like they're not really in the conversation. And so once that happens, I see great potential for Latino vote to really affect the outcome of the election and really be the prominent vote that demographics sort of show that it will be.
Can you speak a little bit to Latino voter turnout in this election as well?
Yeah, so in fact, all our polls and sort of studies will show that it was probably because of this level of disappointment on issues that they care about. People expected, and I will count among those myself, expected lower turnout. The reality is that I think we saw very high turnout. And I think in a way, Latinos and other voters in Texas are sending a message to the rest of the country, really, of the importance of catering to these communities. And I think even if there was a lot of split voting, and I think that's also speaking to the sophistication of the voters. And I think we're going to see very high rates, and I think we're going to see probably one of the most important years in terms of turnout among Latinos. Certainly in areas where we don't see a lot of vote and young voters. And let's remember, Latino vote is a young vote and a lot of first-time voters. So we're probably going to see high rates even among those that are low propensity voters.
Okay. You recently released a midterm poll with LBJ and Univision looking at Latino voters in Texas, what their policy preferences were, and who they trusted most to care about those issues. Did you see differences in concerns or priorities among rural versus urban Latinos?
We did. And this is exactly, again, some of the issues that were raised before, that Latinos, just like any other voter, will shape their concerns towards their surrounding. And so precisely these economic concerns were much higher in rural areas. This is probably one of the reasons why in 2020 we saw a lot of Latinos voting Republican. And then this time around, they probably feel like neither party will really answer their questions in terms of the economy. But we do see a difference where Latino voters in rural areas were highly affected by the economy and highly affected by COVID. Along the border, this was a community that was really disproportionately affected by COVID, and the response clearly tied to economic concerns.
Thank you, Sergio. All right, Dr. Suri, thanks for joining us. Several of the people on the Texas ballot had raised questions about election integrity. In fact, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton had been investigating 10 election workers ahead of this year's election. What post-midterm turmoil might we see, and how does this turmoil impact our democracy?
It's a great question, Tori. Certainly, there's been a lot of concern about election deniers, about those who've been trying to intimidate people going to the polls, and there were a lot of reports from Arizona and elsewhere about that. And we have been hearing from gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake already musings about disputing an election outcome. But for the most part, I have to say, this looks a lot like the 2020 election. Despite many concerns, things were very smooth. There have been a very small number of reports of issues. And candidates, even pro-Trump candidates, many of whom have lost, have actually conceded. So Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania actually called to concede to John Fetterman. And we've seen this in many parts. Governor candidate Michaels in Wisconsin conceded to the reelected governor, Tony Evers. So I'd have to say things have actually gone pretty smoothly. They could be smoother. We could have less of the nonsense on Twitter and elsewhere. But for the most part, it's been pretty smooth. And so I don't anticipate a lot of problems. And I don't anticipate there being anyone like a Trump candidate who's going to cause the same sorts of issues after this election.
Where have we seen the widest partisan divides?
I think the widest partisan divides have actually been in Texas and Florida. My overall assessment of the election is that it is the closest, most divided, most status quo election outcome we've seen in my lifetime. And as a historian, I have trouble finding one that even comes close. It's ironic, considering everyone says everyone's so angry, everyone feels things need to be changed. But in fact, this election will change almost nothing. As of right now, and this will adjust in the next few minutes, of course, but as of right now, the Democrats are leading in 50 Senate races, the Republicans in 50 Senate races. As of right now, the Democrats are leading in 217 House races, the Republicans in 218 House races. I could not design a closer election for you. It doesn't mean it'll come out exactly that way, but I could not make this a closer election. Texas and Florida are the outliers here. Maybe to some extent, Michigan in the other direction. The Michigan House, or I think it's Michigan Senate, has flipped to be completely Democrat now, and Governor Whitman won a pretty convincing victory there. But for the most part, the country is closely divided everywhere, pretty much 50-50, with the exception of Texas and Florida, which seem to be very strongly on the Republican side of things.
So what are the consequences, or what hangs in the balance for Texans this election?
Well, for Texans, this election, a lot stands in the balance. The legislature in its last session pursued a series of policies that just 10 years ago would have been unthinkably radical for most Republicans. That's just a fact. It's not whether you're for them or against them. That's just a fact. Sherri, I think, would certainly confirm that, especially the issues around guns, around women's health, around universities and education. And I think a lot of that will come back onto the agenda of the legislature in this session. And I think that's a real concern. Now, the Republican Party in the state of Texas has to worry that they might be out of touch with the rest of the country, and that's going to pose a problem for them. And they also have to wonder if they're reaching the end of their dominance in the state, but that might actually encourage them to do more. So I think this election, if anything, will make the next legislative session even more raucous and even more filled with all kinds of bills that we might not have expected to see even 5-10 years ago.
What effect did President Biden have on the midterms? Was it less than or greater than previous presidents?
It's so hard to know. I mean, that's sort of like the multi-billion-dollar question. $16 billion at least was spent on this election, and not much changed, right? The first midterm after a new president is elected to office is always in some ways a referendum on that president. And traditionally, many people have heard this already, that a first-term president in their first midterm election loses pace, because those who did not vote for that person are fired up to have a chance to vote against them again. And those who voted for them and are now only mediocre in their support, they don't come out in the same numbers. Biden did so much better. No president has done as well in a midterm in his first term as Biden has since George W. Bush. And that was after 9/11. Which everyone puts a star on as a midterm election after 1911. Biden did better than George H.W. Bush in his first midterm, far better than Bill Clinton, far better than Barack Obama. So you have to give Biden credit. There's no way around that. I don't think it was his presence going out and campaigning. I think Barack Obama had more of an impact as a campaigner. But I do think that Biden's sense of steadiness and the contrast between Biden and Trump still plays very strongly to the advantage of Democrats in many, many parts of the country. To some extent, this was a replay of the 2020 election. And to some extent, we've seen exactly the same result. More votes for Democrats, but still a very, very deeply divided, closely divided country.
What do the midterms tell us about President Biden's next 2 years?
I think they tell us, and I have a piece coming out on this in a few days in the New York Times. I think they tell us that Biden is going to have to be a little more savvy and manipulative in forming coalitions. He's not going to have a wave of progressive support for his legislation, but the other side is not going to be able to produce a wave of support and force him into something. They're not going to be able to force him out of office or do all these things they've been claiming. So he's going to have to do the work, in fact, that presidents always have to do, which is identify some issues where he can create pressures across party lines. And I think there are a lot of those issues out there, the economy being number one. That seems to be the issue that voters cared most about. But also, I would say the abortion issue. What we found throughout the country is almost every referendum, and this goes back to the election in Kansas, but certainly this one, in almost every case, efforts by referendum to ban abortion access failed, and they often failed quite decisively, even in states like Kentucky, as well as in Kansas earlier. That tells me that there is a lot of Republican support for some kind of legislation that would provide some protections post-Dobbs for women's health and women's choices with their bodies. I think there are a number of issues like that, probably 5 or 6, where Biden can get 48, 49 Senate Republicans and maybe Senate Democrats, and 2 to 3 Senate Republicans, which is all he needs in the Senate if he can get through the filibuster. And then the same in the House, playing the same game of coalition building around particular issues.
Do the midterms say anything about the next presidential election?
Well, that's another $16 billion question. And I'm sure that Mr. Ron DeSantis and Mr. Tim Scott and various others are thinking about this every second of the day right now. It certainly weakens Trump's hold on the Republican Party, at least in the short run. But I always, now hesitate when I say that because I've said that so many other times. And his weakened hold seems to just fully grasp again. But his candidates did poorly. His influence on the party clearly did not help the Republican Party. DeSantis's influence clearly had a huge effect. If the Republicans do win the House by a small margin, which is the best they can do under current numbers, it will in part be because DeSantis strong-armed a re-gerrymander of the gerrymander in Florida to create what turn out to be 3 more districts for Republican members of Congress, which will probably be the margin or smaller. He'll claim credit for that, and he'll blame Trump for Pennsylvania. He'll blame Trump if they lose in Arizona. So this will be an advantage for DeSantis in claiming the leadership of the party, but Trump still has a hold over the primary voters, and I don't know how DeSantis is going to deal with that. I think on the Democratic side, it certainly makes for a stronger case for Biden. If Biden decides he wants to run again, he can make a strong case that now in 2 national elections, he's defeated Trump and Trump's candidates. No other Democrat can say that.
Thank you, Dr. Suri. So we do have some questions from our audience. Stephen, it looks like you've answered some of it in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it again for the benefit of everyone. In 2020, there was 1 Latina woman, 2 women of color total running for Austin local office. All of the city runoffs have a Latina on the ballot this December. Can you please talk about the significance of that?
Yeah, and I'm sure I can jump in this as well. She's as attuned to local politics as much as I am. Look, I think it speaks to what we had hoped that the 10-1 system would do, and that would be bring greater diversity representation to our council to reflect what our neighborhoods look like and what our communities look like. And so I think the exciting thing about this upcoming council is that it's going to look a lot like Austin. It's going to look a lot like your neighborhoods. It's going to look a lot like your neighbors in terms of gender diversity, in terms of racial diversity, but also with a couple of candidates. We have there's an opportunity, for instance, in District 9 to elect perhaps the first Muslim representative on council. So there's a lot of opportunity that's there. And so, I think the interesting thing is then how do we start to build coalitions and community across those districts, and trying to see how you can actually advance policy that's going to be reflective for a city that's pretty diverse and has pretty different values depending on what part of the city that you're in.
I think that's true. Not only has the system of government changed when we went to 10-1, Mayor Adler, who has now finished his 2nd term, was the first mayor, and that was the first council under 10-1, but the city itself has changed. We know we've been on this growth trajectory for many years. It is more diverse in so many ways. And I would also point out that by moving to 10-1, not only do you have more diverse districts with that local representation, but it's much less expensive to run in a single member district than it was for everyone to run citywide when it was at large. And so that again means that you have the opportunity for more diversity in so many ways, because the barrier to entry, the cost of entry, and not talking about the mayor's race so much because that one is citywide, but the council districts, I think that's been lowered. And because of that, I think you saw many people running in those open seats, and we're seeing runoffs. And I don't think that we should in any way discount that it really did lower that bar to entry, the cost in those council districts for running.
Yeah, the question is, how do we manage those runoffs going
Well,
forward?
certainly-
right? And at some point, do we start to think about ranked choice voting, perhaps? Who knows, right? I'm just throwing a big idea out there, but there's
Well,
also
that's
things to think about there.
That is a big issue, and so has been governing with 10-1, as you said, and forming those coalitions or not devolving into turf wars, right, among districts.
Dr. Garcia-Rios, I have a question for you in the chat. Who performed well with Latino voters and what did they campaign on?
So at the national level, I think we see different candidates performing in different ways. So I think a good example of this is when we compare Arizona, and when we compare Texas, and we compare Florida. So Ron DeSantis did very well with Latinos. That's with Cuban Americans and with South Americans, right? And Beto did very well with Mexican Americans in Texas. And both candidates in Arizona for governor and the Senate did very well with Mexican Americans. So it's not just about the country, right? It sounds like it's just the country, but it really is. There's something to say about the diversity. So when we talk about the issues, we'll have to then engage with sort of what matters to those Latinos in those areas. And so I think in Florida, they really like the message of freedom. And then there's also been a lot of campaigning on Biden being a socialist. And that matters for those Latinos. A lot of those Latinos, wherever many generations back you want to go, come from countries where socialism was an issue. We can here agree or disagree whether that's a fair characterization, and I'll say that it's a little unfounded on many fronts. But regardless, it's something that resonates with those Latinos, and that's not the case in Arizona, where then there was a lot of worry about abortion more than any other state because the stakes were so high if the governor were to change. And so I think at that point in that state, abortion was the driving issue. And that was probably the one state where really had the effect that Democrats expected in the rest of the country. I agree that this election was remarkable for how unremarkable it was. And I think that's certainly something to be said about Black and Latino voters. That I think they're also sending the message that extreme, both on the Democratic or the Republican side, is not really what they want.
Thank you. So to close today, I'm going to ask everyone to leave us with some final thoughts. Since we started with you, Stephen, how about I start with Jeremi? We'll go backwards this time. Jeremi, can you share some final thoughts with us?
Sure. I think the questions about the future of our democracy remain front and center, but I think they're more complex, and they're not about one election. So I have a list of 3 good things and 3 worrisome things in this election. And maybe I'll close with that because I think all of us care about democracy. That's probably what unites us all and drew us into what we do. And I hope all citizens care about democracy. So one, we did have high turnout, and particularly among young people. We still don't know exactly, but it does look like we had good turnout, very high turnout among young people, including Gen Z, including my son, who's 18. And I think he made a big difference. Second, I think we also do see that we had a lot of informed voters. Voters knew. I mean, Sergio was just talking about this. Voters in different groups knew what they were talking about. This vision of an ignorant voting public is just not right. And then third, our elections, as we talked about before, Tori, they were pretty secure. I mean, we'll get some stories about some issues, but they've been certainly fraud-free, as they've been for half a century, and they were pretty much violent-free, and that's good. That's good. So democracy worked. It functioned, even with all the challenges. 3 things to worry about. We still had a lot of candidates out there who were demagogic, and the demagogic language, the language of extremism, is as strong as ever on Twitter today. There's been no ramping down of that as a consequence, even by those who have conceded. They'll concede and then continue to do this. Second, it's going to be hard to get things done. And one of the real sources of discontent with democracy is the dysfunctionalism of Congress, the dysfunctionalism of so many parts of our government. These are not new issues, but the stalemated 50-50 Senate and 218, 217 Congress is only going to lead to more of that. And that's a real concern for our democracy. And then third, Tori, and I think the thing we have to all care most about at the LBJ School is we still have not seen what we would hope to see in Texas and Florida and elsewhere, which is majority minority states, or states that are becoming majority minority, actually getting representation for them. The state of Texas, it has to be said, it's a fact now, is a state where the representatives elected to office do not look at all like the people in the state and do not share most of their beliefs on most issues. Just take abortion, take gun control, many of these issues. That's a real structural problem, and that only got worse in Texas with this election.
Thank you, Dr. Suri. Dr. Garcia-Rios, final thoughts?
Yeah, I find it interesting that Jeremy sort of finished with 3 things to be concerned or scared about, and I had on my notes 3 things to be excited or hopeful. So the first one is recruitment. I really hope that the message that we saw on the Republican side, which many were surprised to see, that they were recruiting young Latina to run for office. I hope we see more of that on both sides. At the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, all I want is that Latinos' voices are heard. And this also aligns very well with something Jeremy said, which is sort of my second point, is that I hope that this goes hand in hand with Latinos getting the representation they need, they want, and they deserve. In a state where a big chunk of the population Latino, in states, in districts where they're 80-something% Latino, I think having Latino voices that probably understand their needs, as I elaborated during our conversation today, I think will be something to be excited and hopeful for. The last one is that I hope that the narrative that we hear beyond Texas and then emanating from Texas really gets more sophisticated. There was a lot of talk about Latinos becoming more conservative. Know that that'll be a problem. It's just not accurate yet. And what it is that Latino voters are sophisticated, and Latino voters don't always fit in the bipartisan system that was built without having Latinos on the table.
Thank you. Sherri, final thoughts?
Certainly. Some, I think, important thoughts that remain with me are that, as we said, this was a status quo election in many ways. Nationally, it was a status quo election, and it was a status quo election at the state level in Texas. However, at the local level here with mayor and council, we saw some interesting runoffs. And I think that does get to the youth vote. Very high youth turnout, which does inspire me. And so I think that is something to be really bodes well for the future. But redistricting is an issue that we cannot ignore, right? It is the big one in the room. And when you talk about having more representation, for instance, of Latinos in this state, and when you look at what happened in Florida, where the governor redrew the maps, right? Redistricting is the huge issue in the room when we look at diversity or lack of diversity among those who are elected. And that is something that we need to turn our attention to. Issues matter, they really do. And they matter across the board, and you cannot put people in buckets. You're this or that, so this is what you believe. And that's been, I think, we've seen that in a couple of elections now across the country. You cannot make assumptions about, as was said, women because of their religion and abortion. You can't make those assumptions. You can't make assumptions because of somebody's ethnicity or race or gender, that they're going to vote a certain way. Many times, people of low income in urban areas and rural Republicans have a lot more in common than you would think. So issues do matter. And in the end, of course, it all comes out to GOTV, get out the vote.
Thank you, Sherri. Stephen?
Yeah, So Democrats are as guilty of redistricting as Republicans, right? I think that's super important to remember. So it's not just a one-sided issue. Obviously, some one side maybe practiced a bit more, but we look at Nevada. Nevada's a state where Democrats absolutely have benefited from redistricting. So I say that not as a closing thought, but to provide some balance to the question around redistricting. I think, look, if I'm thinking about local elections, I think the one takeaway for me is don't lose your attention span. It's not over yet, right? This is an election that's going to go for a few more weeks. It's going to be an election that if you really care about your candidate and your issues, you're going to have to come out and vote again. So get out the vote. It's going to be super important. For those of us that are really interested in urban issues, the issues of facing our city, affordability, housing, land use, the issues of the unhoused, I'd encourage you to take a look at those candidates' plans, ask questions, and dive more into the policy issues. I think there's some differences amongst all those candidates, and we should be asking those questions. I think the thing for me that steps out for the state of Texas is the urban-rural Texas divide played out hugely, continues to play out, and I think that Jeremi's comments about how the statewide elected officials don't represent the face or diversity of the state of Texas. There's some issues where that plays out geography. Although on the flip side of that, I think it speaks to some of the challenges that maybe the Democratic Party has in terms of candidate quality too. I spent a lot of time thinking about the Texas Monthly asked me to write this thing about the next 50 years of Texas, talk a lot about with folks. And you can say that our state's becoming more conservative, more extreme, and you can, depending on what side of the aisle you fits on, that could be good or bad. But a lot of that has to mean that you got to have sort of moderate politics that reflects a greater view of us. Means we've got to have good candidates on both sides of the debate, and so that may mean that we got to do better. Having better candidates are going to be peeling across different geographies. So there's something I think to think about in terms of what that looks like for our state going forward as well. And paying attention to the state-local divide when we get to the legislature. It's going to be hugely interesting to watch that play out.
That divide has been present for quite a while. And on redistricting, as you said, whichever party is in power is going to redistrict to its advantage. And we have seen that when Democrats were in power, they did, when Republicans are. So I think it gets at the systemic issues with redistricting. Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for your engagement today. I appreciate your questions. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your expertise and helping us unpack the midterms and the elections. This has been recorded. It will be posted online at the LBJ School's YouTube, youtube.com/the LBJ School. It will be available tomorrow morning. Thanks again for joining us. See you soon.